Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is James R. Hagerty. I will tell you all about Bob in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we exert toward others. And when you do it from a leadership position, and you will discover that James R. Hagerty has profiled many leaders in his long career with the Wall Street Journal. You do it to bring people together for common cause. James R. Hagerty, it is a pleasure to have you on Grace Under Pressure. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You are the author of a brand new book called Yours Truly. And it's an obituaries writer's guide to telling your story. I love it. I love obits. I want to tell folks about you. None other than the great columnist and author, New York Times bestselling author, Bob Greene said, "No one understands the treasures to be found in life stories better than James R. Hagerty." And you tell them in Yours Truly. It's a book that provides the inspiring examples of life stories, personal triumphs, disasters, and lots of humor. So at the Wall Street Journal, you're known for writing about people who were not famous, but lived fascinating lives. And your motto is, if obituaries can't be fun, what's the point of dying? So what a great intro. Bob, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you.
Great. So, what led you to write about dead people?
Well, it was not my original goal in life. In fact, it was probably the last thing I wanted to do when I was young. But I was based in the UK for a while, and I noticed that the papers that had really interesting obituaries, and I found myself reading about people I'd never heard of, and looking forward to reading these articles because they were full of great stories and humor and really lots of life lessons. And I started thinking, this is something I kind of like to do someday. And so when the Wall Street Journal finally decided to hire an obituary writer, I put my hand up.
Well, that's great. Well, I love obituaries, and I don't believe it's because I'm morbid, but exactly why you just said so. And I also lived in the UK, and one of my favorite obituaries of the week is what The Economist writes. So I love those stories. And the reason I wanted to have you on the show was you're going to talk about the art of obituary writing, but it extends beyond for our world. Many of our listeners and viewers are in the professional development field, and we all encourage the folks that we work with, the leaders, executives, to tell their own stories or to tell stories. And your book, Yours Truly, is a handbook to telling one story. And for that reason, it deserves attention. So you also have a wonderful sense of humor. And you write that, we don't have a problem with dealing with our personal finances, but when it comes to the topic of dying, we avoid it. And you have a quote here from a funeral director who said, "Talking about sex doesn't make you pregnant. Talking about death doesn't make you dead." So I love that. So how do you keep a sense of humor when you're writing about someone who's passed?
Well, I find that obituaries are not about death; they're about life, and so that's where I start from. And I just look for the best story I can tell. It's not an impressive resume I'm really looking for, because that would just be a list of names and dates and achievements, pretty dull. I'm looking for an interesting story about what somebody was trying to do and why, and then how it worked out. And usually some funny stuff happens along the way, so why not throw that in?
Right. Well, that adds the color in life. And it's what you write, in a sense, what, to use a term we use for memorial services, is a celebration of life. I think very much an obituary is like that. Would you agree with that, Bob?
Yeah, to a large extent. The only thing I would say is that it's not just a celebration, because I don't write only the positive. If something terrible happened to the person I'm writing about, I write about that, and I try to explain why that happened. So it's not a eulogy, but it's similar to a eulogy in that it tries to present somebody's personality.
That's great. Now let's get to so there's a resistance and perhaps in the one thinks of one's life story, but also in my world, people will say, I don't think my story's good enough. When you hear that, Bob, what do you say? So,
I would say think harder. um, I think it's important for business leaders to have stories because I think that's a way to instantly connect with people, and they are looking for some kind of a life story when they meet you. Um, and so I think you just need to think about some of the interesting, strange, odd, funny things that have happened to you and be able to serve those up as something to present yourself as human, as somebody who's run into some obstacles and made some mistakes and figured out how to recover from them. I
sure.
think that's a very valuable skill to have in business. It's also something to cultivate because you want to preserve some kind of a story to leave behind to your friends and family. And it's something you need to start on early, not wait until you're on your deathbed.
That's great. I interviewed another fellow journalist of yours, Steve Lopez, who spoke about his book, Independence Day, about retirement. And he said something similar to you. It's don't wait till you're 65 or whatever. Keep preparing. So similar to that. Think ahead. Now, you provide a great roadmap for telling one story. And you have three questions, which could be coaching questions. So I want to talk about, as you think about your story, what am I trying to do with my life? What does that mean, Bob? So,
Well, for me, it's a starting point to understanding why somebody's life went in one direction or another. And so I always want to start with, well, what was this person trying to do?
mhm.
Because only then can I sort of assess what really happened and whether it worked out. So it's not only what were you trying to do, but why.
And that's my next thing, which is the why, which is in my world we call it the purpose question. What are
Mhm.
you trying to do, and why? And when you explore that with people, do they come to well, actually they're passed on. So, but the others around them kind of see the why, or is it? Do you have to dig for it? What do you find, Bob? So,
Now, some people do, and some people don't. I always find it very interesting. When I meet somebody, I always want to know why they're doing what they're doing, whether they're an
mhm.
electrician or a brain surgeon. And frequently, when I'm writing an obituary, I'll be talking to the adult children of somebody who's died, and I'll notice something like, I see your father went through dental school for 10 years, and then he became an organic farmer. Why was that? And they'll say,
Yeah.
gee, that's a really good question. I never asked him. So
Mm.
this is one reason why I'm so determined that people should leave behind a few clues about what they were up to and why.
Which leads to the third question you have is, how's that working out? So if you have
Mhm.
a person who was trained as a dentist and then became an organic farmer, something wasn't connecting there. So,
That's right. Yeah, I think the two important questions that are often left out of obituaries are how and why. Or maybe I should say why and how is a better order to look at it. We always
right.
find out what they did,
Right.
but I really want to know
That's
why.
right.
And then how did they
Yeah.
do it? How did they manage this? Because that's very educational for the rest of us.
That's right. And I call these coaching questions because I think these are reflective questions that we can ask ourselves, whether we're thinking about our passing on or our daily life. And because and I think you say somewhere in the book that if it's not working out, what can you do better? Am I
That's
quoting you
right.
correctly?
Yeah, these are questions that you should think about, not just when you're writing your story or telling your story, but just periodically it's good to think, what am I really trying to do? And how is it
Um,
working out? Because if that gives you an opportunity to discover that, maybe you need to change your formula a bit or change your strategy.
So true. That's true. So, and yeah, your phrase was, "It's not too late to make improvements." Oh, it
It's
might
not
be
too late, yeah,
for
not too late to improve the narrative because
yeah,
it's kind of nice to have a life story that has a happy ending.
That's true. So, and then I like this thing. You advise, and this is very interesting. Take notes along the way.
Mhm.
And so, and you say those notes they can be written, of course, but photographs and images. Why did you say that, Bob? So,
Well, I think people need to be creative in thinking of how they can preserve bits and pieces of their life story. And some people like me write a lot. That's what I do for a living. So over the years, I wrote thousands of letters home, and I've still got those letters because my mom saved them. So I've got a great record of things that I did. But most people don't really like writing letters or don't
mhm,
like writing anything. So they might think, well, how am I going to collect this stuff without a lot of pain and suffering?
right.
And there are different ways you can do it. Annotating your photos, I think, is a great way
That's
to
right.
just uh, t- preserve memories of what were we doing and why and who are these people, because those pictures are going to survive you and people will wonder some days. But there are other ways too.
Yeah.
We spend so much time on social media nowadays, and most of that stuff is not worth saving, but some of it is.
Mhm.
So, if you find yourself putting something on Facebook or somewhere or LinkedIn that
Mhm.
is pretty interesting and tell something about what you're up to in your life, save a copy of that and put it in a
Right.
little file called My Life.
Right. Well, that's good. I like it. You have something else in here, which is a real, almost a tutorial, reporting tutorial, is to have if I understand correctly, have someone interview you, and you go through a long process. How does that work out, Bob? So,
Yeah, well, being interviewed is another way to do it for people who don't want to sit down and write. Uh,
right.
and it's very commonly done. It's not very often done well, though, because most of us, not being journalists, don't really think about how to interview. And that a lot of people have the idea that all you have to do is ask the question and then you write down the answer and then you go to the next question. But
Right.
usually when you ask people questions, they don't really answer it fully. Sometimes they don't answer it at all. So you have to kind of let them ramble, and they might tell you something very interesting you weren't asking about. But then you have to
Yeah.
come back and say, "But what was it? Why did you do this? Or,
Yeah.
or where was it that you went to college?" So it takes some thought about the questions and some persistence in coming up with a coherent story in the end.
Now, I'm going to take a step back here because we're familiar. As I told you, you both of us like obituaries, and most obituaries we read, or at least mine, are people that of note or famous or whatever. But you have created a specialty of people who are less known. Why did you or the journal decide to go in that direction for so many of these obituaries? So,
Totally by accident. It was decided that we would have three obituaries about business people every week in the Saturday paper in the weekend edition. Nobody really thought it through though, because if somebody really famous dies on Monday, we're going to have the story right away. We're not going to
right.
wait for Saturday. So
Yeah.
I have to be prepared each week with two or three stories about people, and they're not three famous business people who die every week. Uh, so I have to find people who were not famous but had interesting stories. And fortunately, there are a lot of people like that. And I think it gives us something that is distinctive that not everybody else has.
Oh, it did. So okay, now, so they're not famous, and the obvious question: how do you find them? So,
I spent a lot of time reading obituaries from all over the world.
oh,
Over 2 hours a day, maybe 3 hours. I'm scrolling through a service we have called Factiva, which gives me access to papers all over the world and
mhm.
looking for interesting stories. In addition, people sometimes email me, call me up. I see things on Google. I see things in other newspapers that I read.
Mhm.
So there's a variety of sources of ideas. I'm always open to suggestions.
Yeah. Well, I think we'd all like you to do it, but I'd love you to write mine, Bob. But I'm in no hurry.
Well, yeah, you'll improve your chances if you write down some stuff and explain what you were up to.
That's good. One of the techniques, so obituaries of famous people have the highs and lows, and you alluded to this. What's your approach to the non-famous? As you said, you tell all sides of the story or both sides of the story, the highs and the lows. So how do you approach that, Bob? So,
I just try to find out everything I can about the person. I start with anything that they wrote or anything that they said, because I want it directly from them if I can get it,
okay.
as much as I can get. But then I also talk to family members, friends, colleagues, anybody who may have known them. And I read old newspaper articles, magazine articles, and I just try to gather up everything there is and hope that that will produce an interesting story.
Right. Well, they are interesting, and a good half of the book, if I is you have collected them, and it's just wonderful to read. And some are, well, I think they're all worth reading, and some are thought provoking. Some make us laugh, and I love the anecdotal that you have and the incidental fact. So, for example, a throwaway line someone gave you about an individual that said, "After I got out of prison." So,
Right.
and that took you in a whole different way. Did it not for that particular obituary? So
Yeah, that was not really an obituary, but it was an interview I was doing, and I was writing about a real estate investor, and I was just trying to get a quick sense of his early life, how he got to the point of being a real estate investor, and that phrase came up, and I realized all of a sudden that it was going to be a more complicated story than I thought, but also.
And you have another one, which was, I believe, a woman's name, Eula Banks, who was a bootlegger. So, so that's a different coloration we don't hear often. So, yeah.
Yeah, you have to look for those unexpected details. And almost every page has some of those.
Okay. And then I'm digging on the humor here, too, because there was something you talk about how to describe that a person has gone on, and you are very specific. And excuse me, that page, the euphemisms, and you say the final checkered flag was raised for Rachel as she departed her home for an eternally better view of the racetrack.
That's right, yeah, I do collect those euphemisms because most obituaries are just written by family members, and usually in a hurry.
Sure.
They don't want to use the word "died" for some reason, and so they're often very creative. And I think that's fine. We can't do that in a newspaper, but it shows that there's a lot of room.
There was another one right underneath. It says, "Harold met Jesus at 8:27 Wednesday, October 16th, 2019." And then you say the specificity of the statement suggests to me that morning is a good time to die because there's no line at the pearly gates.
That's right.
So that's great. I love that. So when we talk, because you have a chapter on humor. So the person has died. And when we talk about, I know what my answer is, but what role does humor play in an obituary? So.
Well, it's sort of the same role it plays in a Shakespearean play, I think, or in a funeral. If you go to a funeral, you'll notice there are eulogies. And the best moments in those eulogies are when some friend or family member mentions some of the quirks or odd things about the deceased. And that makes everybody laugh, and everybody kind of relaxes. And they kind of realize that, this person is always going to be with us because we're always going to remember these specific personal traits. I think that's reassuring and comforting.
Right. And stepping back from the concept of the obituary, getting to the story part, you have some models of what to follow to how to tell your life story. And that's good for all of us to go through these kinds of exercises. I liked your quote of self-coaching questions to think about where we are, why we're doing it, and what we can do better. So you don't have to be thinking about your passing, but the living. You have a comment on that? Bob?
Yes. I used to just tell people, you should write your own obituary, but more and more I'm thinking obituary is the wrong word to use because A, it freaks some people out. And B, if you say obituary, a lot of people think it's just some brief little note with your
Mhm.
achievements and your survivors and a note about the funeral. So they'll figure, why bother? What I'm really saying is just write something to leave behind. And maybe some of it's going to go into an obituary, but the most important thing is to give your family and your friends something to understand what you were all about. You might
Mhm.
say, well, why would they care? But you might be surprised. When my dad died, we just wrote a very dull obituary about him because we were in a hurry and we had to get something in the paper. But years later, I really regretted that we hadn't asked him more questions about
Mhm.
his life, and now it's too late. I really wish that we had coaxed him a bit more and that he had volunteered a little bit more information about what he was up to and what he
Right.
thought.
Well, yeah, you did have that experience with your mother, and you tell the story that your mother is a journalist, but she wasn't going to write her own story. So if I remember correctly, you interviewed her and wrote up her obituary. Am I correct? So yeah,
That's right. I kind of learned my lesson. And when my mom was 79, I sat her down and we talked for hours. And she was very forthcoming. And I wrote up something that's probably 25 pages. Um,
Mhm.
she was 79 years old, and I thought, this is a good time to do it. How much more can happen to her? I mean, it turned out in my mom's case, a lot more has happened to her, and she's now 95. I've
Yeah.
definitely had to update her story, but I was very glad that we got started.
Yeah.
The earlier you get started, the better.
No, that is a good lesson because I love your line in there where you said, "What more is going to happen after 79?" Well, 16 years later, she's still with us.
That's
So
right.
that's a
Yeah,
good lesson.
a lot of incredible things have happened. It's so don't assume that all of your excitement is over at age 79.
Excuse me, I had a frog in my throat, so I took myself off camera there.
Okay,
So
sure.
you have written some 1,000 obituaries. What has that taught you about mortality? So,
Uh, it's taught me that people should really preserve their stories. Most of us get around to writing a will to take care of what's going to happen with our money after we die, but not many people think about what's going to happen to my stories. And we should think about protecting them because most of us have some good stories to tell, some interesting stories. And while we've told them to our friends and family, they're not going to remember them very well. They're only going to remember half of it. And the way they
right,
tell it isn't going to be much good. So we got to
right.
preserve that original version.
Well, one of the reasons that we in the field of coaching or leadership development talk about stories is because that's how we human beings learn. We learn lessons and from the story. And so I think in some ways, telling your own story, it's not for you, it's for others. Do you have a perspective on that?
That's a very good point. A lot of people will say, "Oh, my dad, he would never have taken time to write about himself. He was too modest for that. He was busy living his life and helping other people." And the implication is that, oh, that would be very conceited and selfish to take time to write down your stories. But to me, it's just the opposite. You are giving your family and friends a gift, and it's a gift that only you can give. And if you don't give it, it's just gone because we can't retrieve it after you're gone.
That's right. And I think thinking further on, it's not just for the living who are there, but should you have grandchildren or their heirs? I mean, you live on in legacy, and it's nice to be remembered.
Yeah,
So,
definitely. Yeah, people don't think about that enough. Yeah, people 10, 20, 30 years from now may really want to have a sense of who their grandfather was or who their uncle was.
right.
And we should provide that. And it doesn't have to be a book. It can be a book, but it can also be just a few pages. That's
Mhm.
invaluable. Most of us really have almost nothing from our grandparents or great grandparents. And there comes a time in your life when you'd like to know more. Uh,
Mhm.
and
No, that's great. My mother was came from a journalist background, and she did a memoir, but also wrote extensively herself. And so fortunately, we have good stories. So I'm blessed. Our family is blessed from that perspective. But getting your story out is important. So you've written so many obituaries. Are there one or two that bring a smile to your face, or that you are most proud of? So
yeah, I have a hard time remembering because I write so many that
I know
become a
I
blur
would
in my
blank
head.
on that too.
But
So
the one that I always think of when I'm asked this question is about a woman named Iris Westman, who I met sort of by chance on a trip home to North Dakota. She was living in a nursing home, and she was at the time 110 years old.
oh,
And I was so impressed by this woman because uh, she was very sharp. We had a great conversation. And I was impressed by what she was not doing. She was not sitting in front of the TV watching cable TV news and getting depressed. She was sitting in her chair and she liked to listen to books on tape. She liked to listen to books on history and travel. And she was just very calm. She said, you know, I can sit here and look out my window and not see anything and be perfectly content. Um, and that inspired me that she was just uh, so calm and collected, uh, and so good at talking about the distant past. The time I met her was 2016. So I asked her, well, you know, what do you think about Donald Trump? And she said, well, I've heard of him, but not really enough to have an opinion. But she did want to talk about Warren Harding. He was president in 1920. She said, you know, Warren Harding, he may not have been the greatest president, but he was awfully good looking. So we had a really interesting chat about her life. And
yeah.
5 years later, she died at age 115. And I proposed to write about her in the Wall Street Journal, even though nobody had ever heard of her. And you know, she had nothing to do with business. She was a librarian and a school teacher. But I wrote about her life, and it was one of the most popular stories I ever wrote. And it just brought home to me that you don't have to be famous. You don't have to have done anything particularly extraordinary to have an interesting story to tell.
Yeah. That is extraordinary when you get to be 115. And I like your, I can think of this as, is it North Dakota or was it
Yes.
South? Yeah. And, sort of a North Dakota Zen, just look out the window.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. Bob, we are coming to the end of our episode here, and I always ask every guest a story about grace. Do you have one that you would like to share with us? So.
Yes, you know, about 18 years ago, this was before I wrote obituaries, I was working in our New York office. And because I had two young kids, we lived way out in the New Jersey suburbs. And I figured out I was spending 15 hours a week commuting. I said, I can't do this for the rest of my life. And so I asked, you know, could I work from home? And they said, well, you know, how would we find you if there was a big story? I had a BlackBerry strapped to my belt and a cell phone in my pocket, but everybody knows that nobody could work from home, right? So they said no to that. So I quit and I took a job in Des Moines where I accepted a job in Des Moines where I thought, you know, I'd have a very short commute. But the final week at the Wall Street Journal, I was covering a big story about the mortgage market. And I was so busy covering it that I missed my own going away party. At the last minute, one of the editors said, you know, we really kind of like to keep you to cover this story. So how about if you just transfer to our Pittsburgh bureau? So, okay, I'll do that. And that is why I stayed with the Wall Street Journal, thank goodness, and got an opportunity to do this job that I really love.
That's great. That is a wonderful, yeah, that someone showed you an act of grace and you have been repaying it in the wonderful stories that you have been telling in obituaries. It's an inspiration. So, Bob, where can we find you? I'll put your LinkedIn bio in our notes, but the book is available everywhere, I'm pretty sure. So
it's easy to order online, and you find it in most good bookstores. If they don't have it, they'll be happy to order it for you.
Yours truly, an obituary writer's guide to telling your story, which is not just important for when we pass, but when we live every day. Bob, it's been such a pleasure to have you. Thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you.